Why did my son call you grandfather, human? You will explain this to me now. Commander Drak did not shout. That was the part Eliot Vance would remember long afterward. Not the words, not the audience of assembled officers, standing rigidly in the briefing chamber of the Ardent Throne. Not the datapad he had been holding when she walked in and stopped everything with a single sentence. What he would remember was how quiet she said it. The way a person sounds when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally decided to put it down. Eliot stood very still. Behind the commander, her son Cale was sitting on the edge of a supply crate, legs swinging, watching the whole situation with the focused calm of a 4-year-old who believes he has done something excellent. "Commander," Eliot said carefully, "that is a long story." She looked at him. "Then you had better start." Eliot Vance was 31 years old and held the rank of Technical Specialist Second Class, which was the kind of title that meant something precise in the filing systems of the Interspecies Coalition fleet and meant very little to anyone outside of them. He repaired things. Specifically, he repaired the environmental stabilization systems on Coalition vessels, the networks of atmospheric processors, thermal regulators, and humidity calibrators that kept beings from 17 different species comfortable enough to function in shared space. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that got written about. The men and women who did it were stationed on mid-tier support vessels, rotated on 4-month cycles, and were consulted by command staff approximately never unless something stopped working. Eliot had been doing it for 6 years. He was by all assessments on record competent and unremarkable. He had been assigned to the Ardent Throne, a Drakari diplomatic cruiser operating under Joint Coalition Command, 11 months before the incident that would eventually require him to explain himself to Commander Drak in front of her senior officers. His posting was administrative in the least exciting sense. The Drakari ran cold ships. Their atmospheric preferences leaned toward lower oxygen saturation and sharper temperature gradients than humans found natural, and the Coalition required any jointly crewed vessel to maintain environmental zones comfortable enough for all personnel. Eliot's job was to keep those zones calibrated. He did this quietly, efficiently, and with minimal interaction with anyone above the rank of lieutenant. He had been on the Ardent Throne for 3 weeks when the Kaveth crisis reached them. The Kaveth crisis was, in the language of official reports, a rapidly escalating territorial dispute between the Kaveth Collective and the Drakari border regions that required immediate high-level diplomatic intervention. In the language of people actually living through it, it was a situation in which Commander Drak suddenly had no choice but to personally conduct emergency negotiations aboard a rival collective vessel, while simultaneously managing the political fallout from 2 other Drakari faction disputes and directing a coordinated military deterrence posture that required every senior officer she had. Every senior officer, every aide, every household staff member above a certain clearance level. Her son Cale was 4 years old by the Drakari age count, which translated to somewhere between 3 and 4 in human developmental terms. He was the commander's only child and had been traveling with her on the Ardent Throne since birth, as Drakari military culture permitted for senior officers in peacetime postings. He had a caretaker, a woman named Sifra, who had been with the family for years. Sifra had a security clearance. The crisis required her presence elsewhere. Nobody arranged alternative care for Cale. Eliot found this out at hour 5 of the crisis, when he came to perform a routine pressure check on the environmental nodes in the family quarters section, and heard, from behind a sealed door, the unmistakable sound of a child who had been alone long enough to start testing the structural integrity of furniture. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he overrode the maintenance access, opened the door, and went in. Cale was sitting in the middle of the main room, surrounded by the contents of what had previously been an orderly shelf of navigational models. The models were not broken, which suggested a methodical rather than destructive temperament. They had simply been arranged on the floor in a configuration that made clear sense to someone 4 years old and no one else. Cale looked up when Eliot entered. He had his mother's eyes, the pale silver gray of Drakari irises, with a characteristic rim of darker pigmentation around the outer edge. He assessed Eliot with a seriousness that most adults could not quite manage. Then he picked up a navigational model of a mid-range cruiser and held it out. "Broken," he said. Eliot crouched down. "Can I look?" He took the model. The lateral thrust indicator had come loose from its mount. A small pin joint, common failure point. He found the pin on the floor nearby, reset it with his thumbnail, and handed it back. Cale turned it over in his hands, then looked up again. "You fixed it." "I fix things," Eliot said. "That's my job." Cale considered this for a moment. Then he set the model carefully aside, picked up a different one, and held it out. "Broken," he said again. Eliot sat down on the floor. He stayed for 7 hours. What happened in those 7 hours was not particularly dramatic. Cale ate the remainder of a meal that had been prepared and left in the suite's cooler. Eliot fixed 4 more navigational models, 2 of which were actually broken, 2 of which Cale had apparently decided were broken based on criteria Eliot could not determine but took seriously anyway. They established a basic vocabulary for communication, which involved a great deal of pointing on Cale's part, and a great deal of careful guessing on Eliot's. At some point, Cale retrieved a worn cloth shape from under his sleeping platform and presented it to Eliot, who understood from context that this was important and responded accordingly. Drakari children, Eliot had read in the standard cultural briefing packets, did not typically demonstrate the kind of physical affection common to human toddlers. They expressed preference through proximity and shared attention. Cale sat closer to Eliot as the hours passed. When he fell asleep, he had worked himself to within about 2 feet of where Eliot was sitting, back against the wall, trying very quietly not to move and wake him. When Sifra came to collect Cale at hour 8, Cale was asleep on the floor with his head approximately 6 inches from Eliot's knee. He woke when Sifra entered, then looked at Eliot, and said a word in Drakari that Sifra went very still at. Eliot did not speak Drakari beyond operational terminology. "What did he say?" he asked. Sifra looked at him with an expression he could not read. "He said the word our children use for a grandparent of great steadiness," she said. "An elder one trusts absolutely, someone who has always been there." Eliot stared at her. "I've been here for 7 hours. Yes," Sifra said carefully. "I understand." She did not look as though she understood. She looked as though she was running a calculation about several things at once. She filed a report. Eliot had known she would. He had thought, reasonably, he maintained, that the report would be noted, given the context of an ongoing diplomatic emergency, and placed in a file somewhere to gather institutional dust. Commander Drak was managing the most significant crisis in the Drakari border regions in a decade. Her toddler had called a human maintenance technician by a word that roughly translated to grandfather of steadiness. Surely there were more pressing matters. He was wrong about this. Cale's vocabulary, it turned out, was not the kind that revised itself. Over the following weeks, as the crisis stabilized and the Ardent Throne returned to its standard operating rhythm, Cale continued to use the word. He used it when Eliot passed in the corridor. He used it at the morning meal on the 3 occasions Sifra brought him through the common crew area. He used it, loudly, in front of Lieutenant Commander Porath, who had stared at Eliot with an expression of professional alarm that Eliot had found it difficult to interpret charitably. Eliot kept his head down. He did his job. He repaired the atmospheric processors and recalibrated the thermal nodes, and avoided making eye contact with anyone above the rank of captain. What he could not avoid was Cale himself. This was not Cale's intention, or not precisely. It was more that Cale had developed a reliable mental map of Eliot's maintenance schedule, and appeared in relevant sections of the ship at relevant times, with the navigational confidence of a small person who had decided that the laws of coincidence did not apply to him. He did not demand attention. He simply arrived, stood nearby, and waited with the patient certainty of someone who knows they will be noticed eventually. Eliot noticed. It was not possible not to. He learned that Cale liked being read to from technical manuals, not because he understood them, but because he found the cadence of precise language calming. He learned that Cale had opinions about repair sequences that were based entirely on aesthetics. He consistently preferred the approach that involved the most steps, regardless of efficiency. He learned that Cale was afraid of a particular corridor junction near the secondary engineering bay, for reasons he could not articulate, but that Eliot eventually traced to an air pressure fluctuation in that section that produced a low-frequency hum below normal hearing range. He filed a maintenance report and corrected it. The next time they passed that junction, Cale walked through it without slowing down and did not say anything, but he looked at Eliot with the particular expression of someone marking a debt. Eliot had younger siblings. He had nieces. He knew how to be with small people. What he had not known was how it would feel to be claimed by one, to become, in the architecture of a child's world, a fixed point. He was trying to think clearly about this when Commander Yisan Drak returned from 6 weeks of summit consolidation and walked into the ship's briefing chamber, where he happened to be performing an overdue diagnostic on the air circulation arrays. He heard her before he saw her. Cale's voice from the corridor, not distressed, just certain. Then the door opened. Cale was in the commander's arms. He was pointing directly at Eliot with the unhesitating confidence of someone presenting evidence. "Sevrak," Cale said clearly. "Neth Cale Sevrak." Commander Drak looked at Eliot. Her eyes were the same pale silver gray as her son's, but without the softness that Cale still had. Hers had been sharpened by things Eliot could only estimate. She had managed the Kaveth negotiations. She had held a military deterrence line for 6 weeks. She did not look tired so much as she looked like someone for whom tiredness had been metabolized into something harder. "Why did my son call you grandfather human?" she said. "You will explain this to me now." Eliot set down his diagnostic reader. "Commander," he said, "that is a long story." "Then you had better start." He told her all of it. He told it standing in the briefing chamber with the diagnostic tools still spread on the floor beside him, because she had not invited him to sit and he had not presumed to. He told her about arriving at the family quarters at hour 5, the door, the navigational models on the floor, the broken pin joint. He told her about the 7 hours, what they had contained, what they had not. He told her about Sifra's expression, and the word Cale had used, and the report he had known would be filed. He told her about the corridor appearances, the maintenance schedules, the technical manual readings, the air pressure fluctuation in the secondary bay junction. He told her about the moment Cale had walked through that corridor without slowing down, and what that look had meant. Commander Drak was quiet for a long time after he finished. She was looking at Cale, not at Eliot. Cale, for his part, was looking between them with the composed patience of someone who knows the situation is resolving correctly, and is simply waiting for the adults to reach the obvious conclusion. "He chose a word our culture reserves for a particular kind of trust," she said finally. "Not to Eliot, to the space between them." "I know," Eliot said. "I read the cultural briefing packets." Something shifted in her expression. "Most humans do not read the cultural briefing packets. I find them useful. I maintain the atmospheric systems that keep your crew functional. Understanding who they are seems relevant." She looked at him then, a look of someone performing a re-evaluation, not of a situation but of a prior assumption. "You repaired the junction hum." Cale couldn't tell me what was wrong, but his behavior pattern indicated sensory discomfort in that section. "It took about an hour to trace. That report came through maintenance," she said slowly. "I read it. It was filed as a routine comfort calibration. It was a comfort calibration. For a child you were not assigned to, for anyone who uses that corridor," Eliot said carefully. "I filed it generally." Commander Drak was quiet again. Cale reached up and patted her jaw with one hand. A gesture of reassurance that was, Eliot thought, probably intended for Eliot's benefit rather than hers. Cale appeared to believe that the main obstacle here was the commander's uncertainty, and that patience was the correct response. He was not entirely wrong. "You will join us for the evening meal," she said finally. It was not phrased as a question. Cale said the word again, Sevrak. With the absolute satisfaction of someone whose careful work has been validated, Eliot said, "Yes, Commander." The evening meal became a second one. The second became a third, and then a week of them in the small dining room off the family quarters, where Cale ate with methodical focus and periodically offered Eliot pieces of food he had decided Eliot needed without consulting him. The commander drank a dark, bitter Drakari infusion long after it cooled, which Eliot noticed and did not comment on. She worked through meals when something was pressing. She did not apologize for this, but she also paused, consistently, when Cale demanded that she look at something, and whatever she was working on waited. There was a discipline to the way she held her world together. It was not the discipline of suppression. It was the discipline of someone who had simply decided what mattered and organized everything else around that decision. Eliot watched this the way he watched systems. Not intrusively, just with attention, because attention was how he understood things. The first time he said something that made her laugh. A dry observation about the engineering department's creative relationship with maintenance request forms. She looked briefly startled, as though she had not expected to be caught off guard in that particular direction. The second time, she did not look startled. The third time, she did not try to contain it, and the sound of it, quiet and precise and genuinely unguarded, stayed with Eliot for the rest of the evening in a way he did not immediately have a useful category for. Months passed. Cale grew. He began asking questions that required actual answers rather than contextual guessing. He wanted to know how pressure regulation worked. He wanted to know what humans ate on their home continent. He wanted to know why Eliot's tools were a different alloy than the ship's standard kit. Eliot answered all of these questions with the same seriousness he brought to every question Cale asked, because that was what the situation required, and also because Cale's questions were, without exception, better than most adults gave him credit for. The ship's senior staff noticed the arrangement before anyone said anything directly. On a ship that small, this was inevitable. There was a period of approximately 3 weeks during which Eliot would enter a compartment and find that several people had suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. They wore the expressions of people who believed they were being subtle. They were not. Lieutenant Commander Porth was slightly more direct. He fell into step beside Eliot in a corridor one afternoon and said, without preamble, "You are aware that the commander does not permit personal entanglements to affect operational function." "I'm aware," Eliot said. "I want to be certain you are aware. I maintain her ship's atmospheric systems and have dinner with her family 3 times a week. I don't think either of us has confused this with an operational function." Porth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has not laughed at anything in 7 months. Not before you." He walked away before Eliot could respond to this. Eliot spent the rest of the afternoon being careful not to think about it. He was not particularly successful. The conversation that changed things was not planned and did not announce itself as significant until it was already happening. They were sitting in the observation alcove off the family quarters, a narrow, curved space with a direct view of open space, the kind of design that suggested someone on the original construction crew had understood what it was to spend months between stars and still need somewhere to breathe. Cale was asleep. The ship was quiet. Eliot had come to check a thermal variance reading in the alcove's environmental node, which had been running slightly high for 2 weeks, and had stayed because Commander Drak was already there and had not suggested he leave. They had been quiet for a while, the comfortable kind, which was a different category from the merely polite kind, and which Eliot had noticed but not remarked on. Then she said, "When the Cavith negotiations were at their worst, the second week, when the collective pulled their senior delegate, I spent 12 hours believing I had miscalculated, that I had made an error that would cost the border regions a generation." Eliot did not respond immediately. He understood from her tone that she was not asking for reassurance. She was placing something in the open air and seeing what happened to it. "What kept you moving?" he asked. She was looking at the stars. "Cale. Specifically, the thought of Cale growing up in a border region defined by a conflict I failed to prevent." She paused. "But also something else, something more precise." She glanced at him. "The report about the junction hum had come through 2 days earlier. I had read it that morning." Eliot waited. "A human maintenance technician," she said slowly, "had spent an hour tracing a subaudible frequency fluctuation because a child was uncomfortable in a corridor. Filed it as routine. Did not mark it for attention, did not mention Cale at all in the report." She was quiet for a moment. "I have officers with a great deal more authority and a great deal less care, I just noticed," Eliot said. "Yes," she said. "You did." She turned to look at him fully. In the reflected light of the stars, her expression was something he did not have Drakari vocabulary for, and did not need it. "Cale chose a word for you that we do not use lightly. Our children do not use it for people they have known for 7 hours. Unless they have assessed something real." "I think he assessed that I would sit on the floor with him," Eliot said. "He assessed that you would do it again," she said. "There's a difference." The space between them was not large. It had been getting smaller, Eliot realized, for months, not physically or not only physically, but in the way that proximity works when you are not paying deliberate attention to it. "And then you are," he said. "Commander." "Listen," she said. "Here in this room you may use my name." That took a moment to settle. "Listen," he said. She looked at him with an expression he had been cataloging for months without quite permitting himself to name. And then, because she was a person who had spent 6 weeks making impossible decisions and had learned not to wait for perfect conditions, she said, "Tell me what you are thinking." So he did. What he said was not elegant. He was a technical specialist, and he thought in systems, in cause and consequence, in the relationship between precision and outcome. He told her that he had spent most of the last several months noticing things he had not been looking for. That somewhere in the gap between fixing a broken model ship and tracing a sound a child couldn't name, he had stopped thinking of the Ardent Throne as a posting and started thinking of it as somewhere he was. That he did not know the Drakari word for what he thought he was describing, but that he suspected it existed. "It does," she said. "Then I'm describing it," he said. She did not reach for his hand. That was not, he had come to understand, how Drakari expressed certain things. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment with the particular attention she gave to things she had decided mattered. And then she said, "When Cale is older, he will tell people he arranged this." He's 4, Eliot said. He is already practicing the story, she said. He told Sifra this morning that he had been working on it since the ship models. Eliot thought about that. He thought about a 4-year-old sitting in the middle of a scattered collection of navigational models, holding out a broken one with the calm authority of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Maybe he was, he said. Then she looked at the stars. Then she said, I would like you to stay. It was 3 words in simple declarative form. It was also from a woman who chose her words the way engineers chose load-bearing materials, a very complete sentence. Yes, Eliot said. Cale's voice came from the interior room. Not distressed, just awake, testing to see if anyone was within range. They both turned. Issen moved first, but Eliot was only half a step behind her. And when they came through the doorway together, Cale sat up in his sleeping platform and said, with tremendous satisfaction, the word, Sevrak. Then he lay back down and went to sleep with the serene confidence of someone who has finished something important. The official joining ceremony was 8 months later, conducted under coalition protocols with a secondary Drakari rite that Sifra had quietly arranged and that Cale had supervised with detailed opinions about every element of the proceedings. He was 5 by then and had developed firm convictions about the aesthetics of ceremonial arrangements. Several of the Drakari attendants found this presumptuous. The human delegation found it charming. Issen found it accurate. Eliot found it impossible to argue with, which had become over the preceding year a familiar condition. When the ceremony concluded, Cale walked directly between his mother and Eliot, looked up at both of them with the measured assessment of someone reviewing completed work, and said, Good. Then he took each of them by one hand and began explaining to the nearest ambassador that he had been planning this for a long time. The ambassador, a Drakari official of considerable seniority and longer memory than most, looked down at the small figure between the commander and the human technician and said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to say what they actually thought, that the child seemed very certain. He usually is, Issen said. The family portrait from that day, later included in the coalition's official record of the Drakari diplomatic expansion period, shows a commander in full dress uniform, a human specialist in his service jacket, and a 5-year-old standing between them with an expression of accomplished calm. Historians who later studied the period would spend a great deal of time on the structural frameworks of the Drakari Coalition alliance, the trade protocols, the joint military deterrence postures, the gradual normalization of interspecies crew rotations. They would write about Commander Drak's negotiating record, her handling of the Kaveth crisis, her role in reshaping border policy across 3 separate regions. Entire academic careers would be built on the question of when, precisely, the alliance crossed from formal cooperation into something more durable. What none of them would trace back far enough to find was a junction in the secondary engineering bay that produced a subaudible hum no adult had thought to report. A child who couldn't name what was wrong but whose pattern of behavior said it clearly enough for someone who was paying attention. A maintenance report filed quietly, marked routine, placed in the general record. A fixed point identified, a problem corrected. Everything else followed from that.